I just want to say I was completely with you until the end when you got silly on us. And the reason I say that is because you speak about God in the same way that you would speak about a human dictator as though they were equivalents.
Much worse.
Much worse. But it's only worse. It's only worse because of the eternity of it, right? But the characteristics are the same.
No, the absolutism of it.
The absolutism.
The
characteristics are the same.
The lack of any appeal.
But that's not.
And the worship of him by.
My first question, we decided to forego long opening statements. We're going to make this as conversational and respectful and fast-moving as possible. And my first question is going to go to Rabbi Wolpe. David, do you expect to go to heaven?
Not tomorrow. That's the old joke about, the good news is that there's baseball in heaven. The bad news is you're pitching Thursday. So what I would say is that part of the problem of the idea of an afterlife is that we tend to make it far more literal than it needs to be, and as a result, it starts to seem ridiculous. I mean, before you entered this world, could you have imagined mountains and tuna fish and teeth and ideas and music? Of course not. It is literally unimaginable. But we make of the idea of another world something that we can imagine and understand, and so we reduce it to nonsense. It's Mark Twain in Letters from Earth. He said that people assume when they go to heaven they're going to lie on green fields and listen to harp music. He says you wouldn't want to do it for 5 minutes while you're alive, but you think you'll be happy for the rest of eternity doing it after you die. And the crux of it is, and I suspect really what this evening will come down to, is do you believe that human beings are entirely material? Are you only made of stuff? Or is there something non-physical? Is there something ethereal and eternal about you, about us, some mystery at the heart of this stuff? And if there is, then there's a possibility, that we'll all, I don't want to say go somewhere because that assumes that it's spatial. And again, that's the way people think, and the way we think is not necessarily the way the world is. Our minds are much too limited to grasp it. But I'll just close by saying that I always assumed that human beings were more than stuff. And for me, at least, this came home on an emotional level when a little less than 2 years ago, my father died. And as many of you know, it is a Jewish custom when someone's buried to throw dirt on the grave. And I thought this was going to be extraordinarily difficult, to take a shovelful of dirt and throw it on the coffin of somebody that I loved very dearly. But I actually didn't find it nearly as difficult as I anticipated, and the reason is that I knew that whatever was in that coffin, he wasn't there. But I also knew that that wasn't the same thing as he wasn't. It just meant he wasn't there, but he was, and he is. I just don't know how.
Sam, in The End of Faith, you chide scientists who believe that consciousness ends with death. So picking up a little bit on what David said, you wrote, the place of consciousness in the natural world is very much open to question. The truth is we simply do not know what happens after death. To my mind, this very much leaves the door open for a belief in the afterlife.
Although it doesn't make the traditional beliefs in the afterlife any more plausible. It's not the point I was making there. But it does, that point of not knowing what happens after death is what worries me about this conversation. I've been very worried about this, that all of you have given up a perfectly serviceable Tuesday evening only to hear the four of us tell you every which way that we have no idea what happens after death. Well, I expressed the spirit of my wife, and she was actually able to put me at ease. I'm worried, obviously, about boring all of you, and she said, nothing Hitchens does is ever boring. So I have that going for me. Right. I think we should think about what this concept of the afterlife does. We'll talk about the plausible versions of it and how implausible some of the traditional ones are. But I think, just to give some context, we're living in a world in which 9 million children every year die before they reach the age of 5. Okay, year after year after year. I mean, that is an Asian-style tsunami of the sort you remember from 2004 every 10 days, killing only children before the age of 5. I mean, think about these children. Think about their parents. Know that virtually all of these parents are people who believe in God and were praying all the while that their children would be saved. And their prayers were not answered. Now, the afterlife comes into the midst of this reality and as a promise that all of this is going to make sense in the end, that somehow at the end of existence, we are going to be all let in on the punchline and have a mighty laugh with Almighty God for eternity. Now, there's no evidence of that, and I think, therefore, this concept of the afterlife really functions as a substitute for wisdom. It functions as a substitute for really absorbing our predicament, which is that everyone is going to die. There are circumstances that are just catastrophically unfair. Evil sometimes wins, and injustice sometimes wins. And the only justice we're going to find in the world is the justice we make. And I think we have an ethical responsibility to absorb this really down to the soles of our feet. And this notion of an afterlife, that the happy talk about how it's all going to work out and it's all part of God's plan, is a way of shirking that responsibility. So that's...
The idea of an afterlife might feel comforting, but comfort isn't evidence. Every credible study in neuroscience shows that consciousness depends on the brain. When blood flow stops, brain activity ceases, and awareness is gone. Even mild oxygen deprivation can erase memories or change personality. Clear proof that the self is rooted in physical processes, not an immortal soul. If the soul existed independently, severe brain injury wouldn't alter who we are, yet it does every time. Historically, every civilization invented its own afterlife. Ancient Egyptians had the Field of Reeds, Vikings had Valhalla, Hindus believe in reincarnation. The Bible's vision of heaven and hell is no more consistent or verifiable than these myths. In fact, early Judaism had no concept of eternal heaven or hell. Sheol was simply a shadowy place for all the dead. Eternal punishment shows up later, influenced by Persian Zoroastrianism. That means Christian afterlife doctrine is borrowed, not revealed. The Bible itself undermines the fairness of the Christian afterlife. In Matthew 25:46, eternal torment is given for disbelief, not moral failure. Revelation 21:8 lists sins alongside unbelief as grounds for the lake of fire. This isn't justice, it's divine favoritism. Even worse, the suffering of children that Sam Harris describes is excused with God's plan, as if the promise of heaven justifies their pain. The truth is, there's no evidence of divine justice waiting for us. Waiting for a cosmic fix is a moral hazard. It can delay action against suffering in the here and now. The only justice humanity has ever achieved, ending slavery, advancing human rights, fighting disease, came from human hands, not divine intervention. If we accept that this life is all we know we have, the responsibility to make it fair and meaningful becomes urgent and real.
Where I am.
Brad, 3 times a day as a religious Jew, you would pray the Amidah, where you extol a God who resurrects the dead. It says that right in one of the most standard of Jewish prayers. When you say that, what are you saying? What do you believe you're saying?
So I need to take a couple steps back and make this a running jump rather than a standing jump.
Sure.
As I understand it, rather than simply reducing someone's idea to a caricature, which is easy to do on all sides in this kind of a conversation, we live in an age in which there are different plausible ways of making sense and connecting the dots. One of them is a kind of reductionism in which everything can be explained by its smallest physical components. And once you've explained how inert matter operates, then you create more complex systems, but you've done all your explaining really at the very basic subatomic levels. And that's completely plausible, and you can tell the entire story that way in a reasonable way. I don't think it's the only way one can do it. One can also say that there are intimations all the way down of what others have called, and I think of as mindfulness. And that the mindfulness all the way down emerges at some point into consciousness, which emerges at some point beyond that into something even beyond the consciousness we're aware of. And we have abilities to access it, not necessarily by what we know. And here I have to say, having read the books of the authors here, I agreed with almost everything that everyone wrote. People claim knowledge where they can't possibly know. But what I think we can also claim is intuitions that go beyond what we know. Things like hope and trust and loyalty. We ground our lives in them. So there are people who use the afterlife as a way of evading their responsibility. But I know that I and Rabbi Wolpe have sat at the bedside of people who were able to connect with others because this belief inspired them to live each moment with dignity and connection. So for me, the prayer is literally false. Having lived one life with flat feet and fat thighs, I fervently hope that God does not physically resurrect the dead. Although I will tell you, I'm one of the rabbis dancing in Gadi Levi's dance thing. So I expect to have buns of steel by the time you come back for that. But I think it's a metaphor for saying that there is a oneness of which we are an expression, and that does not cease with our death, and that in some very important way, although not one that is reducible to knowledge, I don't claim to know, but I trust that we continue beyond the grave.
Thanks. Christopher, what's wrong with that? If a belief in the afterlife helps one, as Brad said, deal with the inevitability of death, maybe this is a good thing.
Well, then anything that made you feel better would be okay, which I'm sorry to say I think is a contemptible viewpoint. Here's the problem with the afterlife fantasy. It's the same as religion in general. If you can't hear, I hope it's not my fault.
Let me just move the mic.
All right, how's that? Okay. Well, not to duck the opening question, give myself a chance to repeat my answer. That would mean that anything that made you feel good or better was fine, which I think is a contemptible position, I'm sorry to say. And it would be as good as drugs, for example. And I don't believe, and in fact Marx never said, that religion is just an opiate. But religion and the afterlife fantasy have these things in common. First, they're man-made. That's very important. They represent claims by humans to be able to interpret the divine and to give themselves power by doing so. We all admit we don't know. That's because we can't know. So the people who have to leave the island right away are those who say they do, who for centuries have tyrannized and still do millions of human beings by claiming to hold the keys of heaven and hell. Leading to my second point, religion is totalitarian in its practice and its theory. It claims to know things it can't know, and it claims to have powers it cannot have. It says if you make the right propitiations and the right donations, you may get paradise. And if you don't, you may get an eternity of pain. That includes, by the way, the souls of unbaptized children of the millions who Sam mentioned. Then there's, I'm afraid to say, but you also, as you'd expect from the man-made, the argument of fraud. St. Peter's in Rome was built on the sale of indulgences. That's to say, in return for cash, the promise of a remission of sin and of time in hell or purgatory. There are chantries, actually quite beautiful ones, still all over Europe, still working. Prayers being said for the repose and remission of souls. Pope Benedict, the most reactionary prelate for a considerable time to lead the church, is trying to restore the idea of remission of sin in exchange for donations or other in-kind operations. This is, I'm sorry if it sounds unduly functionalist, but until we've dealt with these questions, we can't have a serious discussion. Now, there's also, I think, a real problem about anything that's eternal. I should probably close with this. It will happen to all of us that at some point you'll get tapped on the shoulder and told, not just that the party's over, but slightly worse, the party's going on, but you have to leave. and it's going on without you. That's the reflection, I think, that most upsets people about their demise. All right then, because it might make us feel better, let's pretend the opposite. Instead, you'll get tapped on the shoulder and told, great news, this party's going on forever, and you can't leave. You've got to stay. The boss says so, and he also insists that you have a good time. I've read about David's father, and I had a bad time when my own father passed on, but the father proposed by monotheism is the father who doesn't die, who reassures his children, don't worry, I'll never leave you. You'll never see the end of me. You'll never get the chance to feel sorry. I'm always there. I'm the absolute ultimate in dictatorship, and in my courts there's no appeal. Do you really think that this would cheer up anyone of sentience or humanity or capable of feeling of irony? I submit it's out of the question.
Belief in an afterlife might offer comfort, but comfort is not proof. Everything we know from neuroscience shows that consciousness depends entirely on the brain. When blood flow or neural activity stops, awareness ends. Brain injuries, Alzheimer's, strokes, and anesthesia can erase memory, alter personality, and shut down the sense of self. If a soul existed independently, these changes wouldn't be so precise or predictable. Historically, the Christian afterlife is not an unbroken revelation. It evolved. Ancient Israelites believed in Sheol, a shadowy place where all the dead went, Psalm 6:5, Ecclesiastes 9:5. Concepts of heaven and hell emerged later, influenced by Persian Zoroastrianism and Greek philosophy. Even the New Testament contradicts itself. Some verses describe sleep until resurrection, 1 Thessalonians 4:13-16. Others promise immediate paradise, Luke 23:43. And the meaning often depends on translation or punctuation. Biblical justice also raises moral problems. Matthew 25:46 and Revelation 21:8 promise eternal punishment for disbelief, not just immoral acts. The doctrine of hell has been used for power, most famously in the Middle Ages, when the Catholic Church sold indulgences to shorten time in purgatory, funding projects like St. Peter's Basilica. That's a human system built on fear, not divine truth. Near-death experiences don't rescue the claim. Their features, bright lights, tunnels, life reviews, can be triggered by oxygen loss, drugs, or brain stimulation. Crucially, they reflect local culture. Christians meet Jesus, Hindus meet Yama, Buddhists see entirely different visions. If one afterlife were real, these accounts wouldn't vary so widely.
I just want to say I was completely with you until the end when you got silly on us. And the reason I say that is because you speak about God in the same way that you would speak about a human dictator as though they were equivalent.
Much worse.
Much worse. But it's only worse. It's only worse because of the eternity of it, right? But the characteristics are the same.
No, the absolutism of it.
The absolutism.
The lack of any appeal.
But that's not.
And the worship of him by his slaves.
Except that that's not at all what any tradition envisions, and even if it did envision it, as you and I think would both agree, the envisioning of traditions of what a God could be are very limited and partial. And so if you want to make it, yes, that it's North Korea forever, then I would say you're belittling the notion of what it means to have a God. You're belittling the notion of what it means to have eternity in, if not bliss, at least reasonable happiness. And it's true that you lose everything in this world, but also it's not at all the case, and you know that it's not the case, that the notion of the afterlife invariably leads to neglect of what is important in this world. Sometimes, in fact, it does the exact opposite. You can take large swaths of belief. You mentioned Marx. Communism, for example, which repudiated the idea of the afterlife and therefore thought you have to create utopia here, and it led it to horrendous misdeeds throughout the 20th century. So the belief in the afterlife can be totalitarian and terrible, but so can the idea that there's nothing after this world and therefore you have to perfect human beings here. It can work both ways.
I wanted to ask you, Christopher, do you really believe that dead is dead? You don't believe in any kind of consciousness going after death? You believe dead is dead?
Okay. The survival of consciousness independent of the brain, which Sam knows more about than I, and we're getting better acquainted with, is quite different from the religious belief in a mandated path by which you can follow or not follow, leading to reward and punishment. Completely different. It's different in the same way as, say, spiritualism was, which wasn't really a religion, but was a very strong, fraudulent movement that not coincidentally flourished after the First World War in the hope of putting people in touch with dead relatives and so forth. Not one single interesting thing ever got said from the other side. Fascinating, you know. Burblings from the beyond, but millions of people pitifully paid attention to it. I guess my answer has to depend on David's point about stuff. We actually know a great deal more than we ever did, than any of our predecessors did, about what stuff we're made of. We know that our DNA gives us enormous amounts in common with other animals, huge amounts. We know that stars had to die. Larry Krauss makes this point very well in his lectures on physics. Stars had to die. One every second blew up, and is still blowing up since the Big Bang. We're made, if you want to call it pretty, from stardust or nuclear waste, depending on your on your analysis. But there's absolutely no reason to think that those molecules would be worth reassembling. That they will rejoin, as do the animals, and as have done the species we didn't know about till recently, the other human tribes, the Cro-Magnons, the Neanderthals, the ones that aren't even mentioned in any holy book. They only died out about 20,000 years ago. Who has heaven and hell for them? It's as likely for us as it is, I think, for any other dog, whale, or bacteria.
Well,
and no more than that.
Sam, what does it mean when you write that you think that consciousness may indeed survive?
Well, there are many odd ways in which consciousness could survive, and you can make a philosophically respectable argument that consciousness could survive the death of the brain. It's by no means the majority opinion in neuroscience or philosophy that it would. For instance, there's a philosopher at Oxford, Nick Bostrom. This is one of the weirder arguments, but still more plausible than the arguments you get from religion. Nick, there's actually very little you have to assume to make this seem somewhat robust. The argument is called the simulation argument, and he argues that we are all very likely not living in a real universe, but living in a simulated universe. And we are being simulated on the hard drives of computers of the future. Now he gets there with a few simple steps. You simply have to acknowledge that consciousness is at bottom the result of information processing at the level of the brain, and there's nothing magical about brains. It could be information processing in a computer of the future. Most scientists think that's true. They don't think there's anything magical about the wet stuff in our heads, and that consciousness is at some point going to be instantiated in computers. Then you simply have to grant that humans of the future will run simulations of the past in the way that we run simulations, Sims games, and then there's just one short move, that simulated universes, almost by definition, will outnumber real universes. And therefore, we are a lot more likely to be among the simulated ancestors than the real ancestors. Now, again, everyone acknowledges it seems a little crazy, but the assumptions that you take on board are not so weak. And I would add to this the somewhat disconcerting idea that if, in fact, we are running as a simulation on a computer of the future, This computer could have been built by Mormons or Scientologists who would want to simulate the truth of their religion. And therefore, all religions could be true in this simulated universe. And we could expect to see Jesus coming back on clouds of glory and moving to Missouri as the Mormons expect. So now all of that sounds completely crazy, but it is not as crazy as the version of the afterlife that is really on offer traditionally, which has been actually neatly sidestepped here because it entails the resurrection of the dead. Most people think that the afterlife religion is offering, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, has something to do with the soul floating off the brain into a tunnel of light and into paradise. But that's actually not the canonical afterlife. The canonical afterlife is God has to do the humble work of reassembling us. And I don't want to take more than a lot of time here, but I think we should talk about just how implausible that vision is, because that actually is the vision of Judaism and Christianity and Islam.
I just want to make one quick addendum. There's also, who I thought you were going to talk about, is Galen Strawson. I mean, another Oxford philosopher who says that consciousness is actually so impossible philosophically to figure out that it must be that it exists even in inanimate matter, even though it doesn't seem that way. So I don't think that but let's leave aside how difficult consciousness is to figure out without some sort of either strange hypothesis or spirit. Yes, it's true that much of Judaism talks about resurrection, much of it talks about afterlife, but there's a plurality of voices. And I mean, the Talmud says, for example, you assume that the sages are in paradise, but it is not so. In fact, paradise is in the sages. That's not the sort of voice that generally you hear when the literalist view of an afterlife is attacked. And for more on that, I turn to my colleague, Rabbi Brad Artson.
I would actually love for us all to go out to coffee and leave them aside so that we could say things like, wow, that's really interesting, I haven't thought about that. And what do you do with this? Rather than the scoring of points. And so there's a lot of cleverness and there are a lot of quips. But at the end of it, what it sounds like we're saying is that religion is a monolith, and the worst of religion is compared to the best of science, which is fluid and evolving. And I'm halfway there with you. I think one of the greatnesses of science is its capacity to be self-reflective and its capacity to change convictions. But the wreckage of scientific error is fairly impressive, and the diversity of religious thought is also, I think, undergirded, unfortunately, I think in part because we all had bad religious education as kids and we're still in recovery. So,
but Bradley, I want to accept your challenge, but is Maimonides the worst of religion? Maimonides came right out and said you have to believe in the resurrection as a literal
yes, and
truth.
Maimonides also said that what I've written in my book is disguised so that people will, if they need literalism, latch onto it and miss what I'm trying to say. And he also said that we call the world to come because we don't experience it during this lifetime, but eternity exists at the present. And if you attain a right consciousness, you can be in eternity now. So the challenge is, we all come to it with our own different concrete needs, but religion is, I think, far more nuanced. And I guess the plea I would like to offer to you, because the parts of your books, both of you gentlemen, that I agreed with was everything you trashed religion for, it deserves to be trashed for. I have an autistic son, and if I believed in that bully in the sky, I would have to tell Dr. Wexler that I was leaving my employment. But I don't, and I don't think that my tradition or the Buddhist tradition or the richness of Hindu tradition understood in a nuanced and ethical way is any more problematic than science's capacity to learn from its mistakes and to move on. And the way the Bible is used in my community with my students is, I would hold up as ethical as anywhere else. And a part of that is the recognition that although we do not know, we hold to hopes that orient us and allow us to value each other as of abiding significance.
What this closing exchange really exposes is how flexible religious claims become when tested. The rabbis here admit they don't take resurrection literally, yet it's in core Jewish and Christian doctrine. The Nicene Creed explicitly affirms the resurrection of the dead. Maimonides, one of Judaism's most revered scholars, wrote that belief in bodily resurrection is required, even if privately he reinterpreted it. This shows a pattern. When literal claims are challenged by reason or science, they're rebranded as metaphor. Science gives us no reason to expect reassembly after death. Our DNA and brain structure don't store you in a way that can survive destruction. The idea that God would gather your atoms ignores the fact that atoms are constantly recycled into other organisms. Your resurrection would mean undoing billions of years of natural processes, for which there's zero evidence. And history tells us that beliefs about the afterlife have never been consistent, even within Christianity. Early Christians disagreed over whether the soul sleeps until judgment or goes immediately to heaven. The doctrine of eternal hell, used for centuries to control behavior, wasn't uniformly taught until long after Jesus' death. Religious nuance doesn't erase the harm of the literal version. Billions have been told that salvation hinges on belief, with eternal punishment for doubt. Mark 16:16, Revelation 21:8. The fact that some believers now reject the bully in the sky is progress. But that progress came from human moral reasoning, not revelation. Science's self-correction is a strength. Religion's shifting definitions are often an attempt to preserve authority when old claims become indefensible. If eternity exists now, as some claim, it's still not evidence for life after death. It's just a philosophical reframe. The honest position remains. We do not know, and there's no credible proof that consciousness survives death. Which means the value we give each other in this life is the only kind of immortality we can verify. So here's the question. If meaning, love, and justice are all built here and now, why stake our lives on an unproven promise? If you found this breakdown thought-provoking, drop your thoughts in the comments, hit like, and subscribe for more deep dives into debates that challenge what we think we know.
Remarkably, a very strong case can be made even without looking at Christian documents to begin with. Using only non-Christian documents from the 1st century after Jesus. I'm talking about people here like the Jewish historian Josephus, Roman historians Tacitus and Suetonius, Roman writer and governor Pliny the Younger. These are all non-Christian sources writing within the 1st century after Jesus.
Well, I want to reply to Callum. First of all, I've already conceded for the sake of argument that the probability of the resurrection, given the McGrew's evidence F, is very, very high. So, I mean, I said I'd give it a 1 minus 10 to the negative 14th, which is 14 nines. So I already said that. So basically everything Callum had to say is irrelevant. I conceded that to begin with. Let's talk a little bit about Bayes' theorem. I want to talk about Bayes' theorem and the swamping of the priors. I can see this is going to mess up my PowerPoint the way it is formatted, but I think we can still live with that. So this is known as the odds form of Bayes' theorem. If you have two hypotheses, can I move around with the sound okay? So if we have two hypotheses, H and not H, the probability of each of them on evidence E will be equal to the probability of H and not H in and of themselves. That's this term here. And the degree to which each of H and not H makes the evidence E likely. This is called the explanatory likelihood or explanatory power. This is called the prior probabilities ratio, and that's the posterior probability ratio. So, even if the prior probability ratio is very, very small, if the explanatory power ratio is sufficiently large, then the final probability ratio will itself be very, very large mathematically. You don't need a lot of algebra to see this. If this is a whole lot larger than the degree to which the prior probability is small, then the posterior probability ratio will be very large indeed. And if the prior probability ratio is extremely small, if the explanatory power ratio is massively larger, then the final probability will be extremely large as well. Okay, so this is something I'll be using tonight. Let's look at an example from Whately and Napoleon. This is Richard Whately, who wrote a very important book, very famous book called Historic Doubts Relative to Napoleon Bonaparte, and I'll let Napoleon speak for you. So let's let N stand for the hypothesis that Napoleon existed, and this little tilde means not, okay? So not N is the hypothesis that he did not exist. And we can see here by Bayes' theorem that the probability of him existing given the evidence divided by the probability of him not existing given the evidence is equal to the ratio of the prior probabilities times the explanatory power ratios. So let's suppose this is very, very small. Let's suppose it's 10 to the negative 12th. And this is very large, 0.99999999999, so it's very large. So our ratio is approximately 10 to the negative 12th. But let's assume we have 1,000 pieces of evidence, NE, excuse me, and so each piece of evidence is made twice as likely by N as not N. So we're going to have a staggering explanatory power ratio. Well, so this will be about 10 to the 300th power, and so you can do the math, right? 10 to the 300th minus, right, 12 will be 10 to the 288 power. We will have a staggering final probability for the existence of Napoleon. In fact, the evidence will make the existence of Napoleon probable to 1 minus 10 to the negative 288th power, which is a massive, massive number, right? We don't normally see things like this. Now, what does this mean for the resurrection? Those who, like Callum, hold that the prior probability of the resurrection divided by the probability of the prior probability of Jesus not rising is no less than 10 to the negative 30th, and who, like the McGrews, hold that the ability of the resurrection to explain the evidence F, right, is at least 10 to the 44th times higher than the probability of the non-resurrection theory to explain the facts F. We will find that the final probability of the resurrection theory will be 1 minus 10 to the 14th, or 0.9999999999999. That's a lot of nines. In other words, if the evidence is strong as the McGrews say, and if Callum is right that the prior probability of the resurrection is no less than 10 to the negative 30th, then the final probability of the resurrection will be staggering, given that evidence. Okay, so here's Whately. I like the swamping of the priors very much. You should, okay? Now, I'm sorry the spacing of this is off. On my home computer it worked fine. Tonight we're going to use the swamping of the priors to show that it is virtually certain that no miracles, not just the resurrection, no miracles at all have ever occurred, including the resurrection. And of course Whately would say, well, no, I don't like that, okay? And so, time for Callum, okay?
I think, yeah, okay, I'll just say a brief bit just to make sure I've explained from my own end, like, everything, but it probably won't be anything new.
I think it may be showing mine now, so
yeah,
I'll have to switch.
Oh, there we go. Okay, so this is mine, okay. So here, oh, is it not? How do you make it stop? Oh, there we go, okay. Okay, so here I've just done R, meaning the resurrection, instead of the normal hypothesis. And yeah, I've got the same form as Greg's put up, but just switched these latter two factors round. So yeah, just basically the main thing, at least from my perspective, to bear in mind is that the final probability of the resurrection, given the evidence, is going to be dependent on a few things. And so we don't really need to understand maths hugely to get this. You just need to grasp that it depends on a few different factors which we'll be debating tonight. And the first factor is the prior probability of the resurrection. And that just means how likely is it that the resurrection occurred before we look at any of the evidence. And this is probably going to be quite low. It might not necessarily be really low, and we'll probably debate that. But the idea is that it's fairly low, and then that the evidence will increase the probability so that the final probability of the resurrection, given the evidence, is a lot higher. And whether the evidence overcomes that is dependent on this middle factor. And the top part of that middle factor just says the probability of the evidence given the resurrection. That just means if the resurrection happened, would we expect the evidence? Does the resurrection theory roughly predict the evidence we have? And the bottom factor just says, what is the probability of the evidence given that the resurrection didn't happen? And so we might again disagree on this, but the idea from someone who's advocating the resurrection is that they will say, if the resurrection didn't happen, this evidence is really, really surprising. We wouldn't expect to find this evidence if the resurrection didn't happen. So the idea is that that bottom factor is low. And if the top factor is high and the bottom factor is low, the whole factor will be a very high number, and so it will increase the original probability for the resurrection. So I think that's pretty much enough to get us covered. And like I say, if you don't understand it completely, don't worry. The idea is that the probability of the resurrection, given the evidence, is dependent on these things, and that's the things we're going to be debating about. Thanks a lot.
Bayes' theorem shows that for an extraordinary claim, your starting probability, the prior, matters. In the case of a resurrection, the prior probability is extremely low because, in all of human history and biology, no confirmed case exists of a person coming back from the dead after days in the grave. Clinically, brain cells begin dying within minutes without oxygen, and irreversible decomposition starts within hours. This is why medical science treats resurrection as biologically impossible. Historically, miracle stories are common in many cultures. Apollonius of Tyana, Romulus, and Osiris all have resurrection legends. Yet we don't accept them as literal history because they lack contemporary, verifiable evidence. The same problem exists with Jesus. The Gospels were written decades after the events by anonymous authors based on oral traditions, and they contradict each other. For example, Matthew 28:8 says the women ran to tell the disciples right away, while Mark 16:8 says they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Using Bayes' theorem honestly, the combination of an extremely low prior probability and weak, inconsistent second-hand evidence means the mathematical odds remain vanishingly small, just as they do for every other resurrection claim in history.
So I'm going to begin with a story. The story is this. The year is around 4 BC, a small, rowdy but unimportant corner of the Roman Empire. Caesar Augustus is lord over Rome, most of Europe, North Africa, and Israel. It's an unhappy arrangement. Most Jews begrudgingly submit to their de facto king, while others violently resist. In a small countryside of shepherds, fishermen, and outcasts, a baby is born. He grows up fairly modestly, submitting to his parents, working as a manual laborer in nearby towns. 30 years pass, and he might well have lived and died with no one ever knowing. But one day things change. This nobody finds a few other nobodies fishing, and they join him. This nobody performs miracles, not to the important people or to kings, but to peasants. Not to win acclamation, but to heal and to serve. There are no megachurches, no flashing lights, no #1 Yeezy album. He reaches out to oppressed people, to untouchables, and to other outcasts, healing them and inviting them to join his kingdom. To join not for material gain, but for friendship with himself, the king. A king who bends to wash the feet of his subjects and humiliates himself so that the last, the least, and the lost can be honored. And so important people from the city begin to hear things. And so they test him. Who is the king? Do we pay taxes to the king, Caesar? If he says yes, he gets killed by the Jews. And if he says no, he gets killed by the Romans. So Jesus asks, whose image does the coin bear? Caesar, they reply. Give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. The coin bears Caesar's image, but you bear God's image. Caesar can have his coin. I want you who hate me and who try to kill me. And so his disciples later protest at the anger and all the things that have been said against him. And they say, Lord, call down fire on them. Jesus' best friend even goes to kill one of his arresters. But Jesus rebukes him and heals the man. Love your enemies, he tells them. Real enemies, those who arrest you and crucify you. And so as he claims kingship and divine authority, as he judges the important religious people for hating their enemies and outcasts, they kill him. They give him a death so excruciating and lonely that Roman citizens were exempt from it. A death so shameful that Hebrew law regarded the crucified as accursed by God. And so the movement was dead. The wannabe king died as he was born, a lonely, rejected loser from Nazareth. But a few days later, those who followed him and abandoned him began to preach that he was alive and that he was king. Those who rejected him all along began to say the same thing. This band of losers from the Galilean countryside traveled across Europe, Asia, and Africa, declaring that this crucified criminal and blaspheming peasant had been raised from the dead. People from the lakes of Galilee and from the high council in Jerusalem began to throw their lives down for him. They shared any riches they had with the poor, prayed for their enemies, were thrown into prison, and killed with stones and crosses, so that a few decades later, bishops in Syria were writing, "Come, fire and cross, come hacking off of limbs, come crushing of my body, and come the cruel tortures of the devil. Only let me reach Jesus Christ." And the invitation these early Christians had was this: Come to join this kingdom with a king who sits not on lofty thrones but nailed to a cross, by his own subjects whom he loves and serves. A kingdom that prevails against the corrupt, greedy and violent kingdoms and states of this world. A kingdom that endures against suffering and even against death itself. A kingdom that offers such freedom that those who join in it endure against all afflictions, and such freedom that comes from friendship with the king himself. A freedom from the shackles of shame or guilt, from the need for popularity, from the longing for reputation or acceptance, and from any other secret addiction to money, sex, or whatever else we long for and beat ourselves up over. And so this is a challenge. The king tells me that I must love my enemies and forgive those who wrong me. He tells me that if I don't have time for the lowest, most unimportant person I come across, then I don't have time for the king of the universe himself. And that's the kind of radical acceptance he asks for. But following this servant king is a challenge that many from the very start have accepted, and with it changed the world. So the question now, of course, is how did this all happen? What led this band of outcasts, council members and Romans to go willingly to their deaths in the name of a public embarrassment? Jesus. I'm going to be arguing that the evidence we have strongly suggests that God raised Jesus from the dead to vindicate his ministry and to start a movement following him. So remarkably, a very strong case can be made even without looking at Christian documents to begin with. Using only non-Christian documents from the 1st century after Jesus. I'm talking about people here like the Jewish historian Josephus, Roman historians Tacitus and Suetonius, Roman writer and governor Pliny the Younger. These are all non-Christian sources writing within the 1st century after Jesus. And from these people we learn the following: that Christians were widely persecuted across the Mediterranean from a very early age. That Jesus' own brother James was executed by Jewish authorities in AD 62. That Jesus himself was crucified under Pontius Pilate in the reign of Tiberius. That the movement stopped briefly before resuming on the 3rd day, is the language Josephus uses, in Judea before spreading to Rome. That Christians met on a fixed day, as Pliny writes. That Jesus was called the Messiah, the Christ. That he was called and known as a wise man and a miracle worker. And that Christians even prayed to him as a god. That Christians had a stringent moral code, and that they spread widely in large numbers very shortly after Jesus' death. And so it's important not to underestimate the force of this evidence. Many of these facts are attested multiple times across these non-Christian authors and are beyond historical doubt. So, there are a number of other facts we can establish without the resources of Christian writers and biographers. It is virtually certain that any given Jewish criminal in Palestine in the reign of Pilate would be buried in a known place. I have laid out some of this evidence for this elsewhere, and I will just summarize it now. There's a divine command throughout the Old Testament to bury the dead, both for the dead's sake and for the land's sake. Since anyone hung from a tree is cursed according to Deuteronomy, there's an extra reason not to leave someone who was crucified out without being buried. God commands explicitly that anyone executed must be buried properly in order to avoid defiling the land. So this wasn't just something that was for the sake of the dead person. This was something for the land. And so it doesn't matter that Jesus would have been a criminal. What matters is that the land was holy to the Jewish culture. And so there would be an absolute obligation to bury them. This command is reiterated throughout the Old Testament and afterwards, both in apocryphal literature and in the Dead Sea Scrolls found at Qumran. In addition, 1st century writers Philo and Josephus repeat these same sentiments, and in later rabbinical writings, in Midrash, in the Talmud, and other Jewish writings after the time of Jesus, the need for burial is re-emphasized again and again, and it's even commanded to high priests. This non-Christian historical evidence is clear about burial protocol. Bones from the corpse were collected a year later and put in an ossuary. In the case of criminals, ossuaries would be transferred to the family tomb. Public mourning for criminals was prohibited, so praying inside tombs was often necessary, and excavations have confirmed this. Spices and perfume were typically taken to the tomb, and respected holy men would usually have their tombs venerated. And finally, we know from non-Christian literature, from Jewish writings, that the Sanhedrin, the High Council in Jerusalem, was given a specific duty to provide a tomb for executed criminals. And so, even if there were no reasons to remember where Jesus was buried,
Callum's account is moving, but emotion isn't evidence. When we strip the narrative back to history, the resurrection story starts looking like many other religious legends. Josephus, Tacitus, and Pliny the Younger, the non-Christian sources often cited, weren't eyewitnesses. Josephus was born after Jesus' death, and the famous resurrection line in Antiquities is recognized by many scholars as a later Christian edit. Tacitus wrote about 80 years later, likely repeating what Christians already claimed. This is exactly what we see with other myths, like Apollonius of Tyana, where later historians recorded stories without verifying supernatural events. The burial claim also doesn't hold under real-world Roman practices. Crucifixion was meant to humiliate, and Rome often denied proper burials to those convicted of treason or sedition. The archaeological record backs this up. Only one crucified victim from Judea, Yehohanan, has ever been found with a burial, and even he appears to have been an exception due to family influence. The Gospels themselves disagree on the burial. Mark 15:46 says, Joseph of Arimathea alone wrapped the body. John 19:39-40 adds Nicodemus and 75 pounds of spices. Matthew 27:62-66 uniquely claims guards were posted. Details that read more like theological embellishment than consistent history. And while Miller frames the spread of Christianity as proof of resurrection, history shows that growth and martyrdom aren't unique to true events. The followers of Sabbatai Zevi in the 1600s, convinced he was the Jewish Messiah, endured persecution even after he converted to Islam. Devotion proves belief, not that the belief is accurate.
Well, I want to reply to Callum. First of all, I've already conceded for the sake of argument that the probability of the resurrection, given the McGrew's evidence F, is very, very high. So, I mean, I said I'd give it a 1 minus 10 to the negative 14th, which is 14 nines. So I already said that. So basically everything Callum had to say is irrelevant. I conceded that to begin with. So, he regave the argument for the resurrection. I already accepted his conclusion and said that is irrelevant to start with. I granted that the resurrection miracles have a high prior probability. I do want to say that Callum did not reply to any of the specifics of the argument I gave, but I want to point out here, I don't know if you can see this. Can everyone see this okay over here? Okay. Callum argues that God would do certain things. It's probable to some degree that he would. I want to argue against Callum that for any proposition P, unless P is actually entailed by, let's use G for theism, since I've used T for testimony. So let's let G be theism. I want to argue that the probability of any proposition P on G is simply undefined unless P is entailed by G, or unless G is logically, probabilistically independent of G. So I want to say that this is simply undefined. G alone does not have enough content. You can't get any specific probabilities out of G alone because G does not have a value theory. You have to add to G some kind of a value theory. So let me write this. This is not a good pen. We'll have to talk about the probability of any proposition P on G conjoined to some value theory G, such as that God has certain obligations to do certain things for humans, right? Now, then you can get some interesting probabilities, but the thing is, your value theory V will need to be proven first, and all the examples Callum has given are where the probability of V is undefined or not high enough. So when he argues that God would be likely to do this or that, I simply think we don't have any proof of that, unless he's speaking of what we call subjective degree of belief. If those are his personal subjective degrees of belief, then I agree with him. Those may indeed be high. But if we're dealing with rational degree of belief, right, epistemic probability, his probabilities are not epistemic, they're personal. I want to go back and talk about something from our debate 3.5 weeks ago that Callum did not address. I meticulously laid out a huge argument showing how if you accept, and much of what Callum had to say about the burial of Jesus and things like that are not in dispute. I simply think those are red herrings. What I argued last time, and I gave a Bayesian argument to show that it was very probable, Callum did not reply to that 3.5 weeks ago, he hasn't replied to it tonight. I showed in detail that if you accept the hypothesis that Matthew's purpose in writing his resurrection stories is to supply the missing appearance to the disciples in Galilee that's not in Mark. You can explain every single aspect of the resurrection stories in Matthew. They all fall, the predictions are immediate. They all make perfectly good sense. Matthew includes Jesus' statement to the disciples, "Go to Galilee, there you will see me. I will go before you to Galilee." The angel says that to the women at the tomb, go tell his disciples he's going before you to Galilee. And in fact, in Mark, we have the story where the women are afraid. They say nothing to anyone, but Matthew leaves that out on purpose. This is not because he's a historian. He realizes if he has that story in there, he can't have Jesus appear to the women. And so he cuts that out. He actually has Jesus appear to the women only long enough just to say, get those guys to Galilee. And so they go to Galilee, and there they see Jesus. All this is explained perfectly by Matthew being a literary construction, not actually based on history. This is not to say there was not an empty tomb. It's not to say there were no appearances of Jesus, but it's to say you cannot rely on the gospel details. Now, I showed last time that if you accept this as a literary theory, you can explain the data of Matthew's gospel. If you accept Matthew's gospel as being literally historical, you cannot explain this to the same degree. I gave a Bayesian argument. I even assumed once again that the prior probability of the hypothesis that opposes mine is 0.9. I still showed how my hypothesis reaches a high posterior probability. Callum did not address that 3.5 weeks ago. He's not addressed it tonight. I also showed that you can explain Luke's gospel as, again, a literary construction, not based on actual history. I am no ways denying that there were appearances. I explained those last time. The disciples went to Galilee. They saw Jesus the way Jesus told them. He said, Jesus told them before he died, "You will see me risen from the dead." And they went to Galilee because Jesus had told them that's what they'd see. And of course, they meditated, they went into trance states, they did see Jesus risen from the dead. Not as a physical body, but as some kind of a ghostly-like apparition. Callum made a big point over the fact that they knew the difference between ghosts and bodies. This is true. But Jesus told them that they would see him up in heaven as a spiritual figure. They saw exactly what he told them they'd see. Now, when we move on to the Gospel of Luke, which is 30 years later, I again claim 3.5 weeks ago tonight that you can explain all the details of Luke's gospel as a literary construction. He leaves out Jesus' statement, "Go to Galilee." Why does he do that? Because Luke has all the appearances either in Jerusalem or right near Jerusalem. He can't have the disciples go to Galilee. If they run off to Galilee, they won't be able to see him in Jerusalem that very day, right? So he cuts that story out. It's not a coincidence that Matthew has that and Luke cuts it out. You can explain this as a purely literary construction. The appearance to the women by the two angels in the tomb, and what you can't see this here, unfortunately, it's not clear enough, but if you compare the statement of the angels in Luke to what is said in Mark, Luke is a very conservative author. He'll only change an earlier author if he has to, and he makes little changes what Jesus has to, what the angel says. He leaves in "Jesus told you," and he leaves in the word Galilee, but now he says, "Do you remember how Jesus told you while he was still in Galilee?" Right? And go home and don't take my word for it. Never take my word for it. Go home, compare the statement of the angels in Luke to the statement of the angels in Matthew to Mark. And you can easily see changes being made by the later authors on purpose. The appearance to Peter, the appearance at Emmaus, the appearance in the upper room, right? All those are literary constructions because Luke has a need to have Jerusalem as the central place, the birthplace of Christianity. If you take that hypothesis, it explains all the literary data you find in Luke. It explains also why in John, right, you find Jesus appearing in the upper room too, because John is a later gospel. It explains the Thomas story. It explains why Jesus later on appears in Galilee, because John knows both Matthew, who only has an appearance in Galilee, and John knows of Luke, who has appearances only in Jerusalem, so John has them both. He's the latest gospel. You can explain all of this. So Callum made a big deal about the details of the appearances, that they were multimodal, talking with Jesus, walking with him, touching him. All that comes from simply not responding to my literary hypothesis, which I gave a Bayesian argument for 3.5 weeks ago today, to show, and we can call that up, to show that you cannot rely on the Gospels in detail as evidence for the resurrection. You can get some general points from them, but you can't press the details. At least this much. Neither the McGrews, Craig, Lacona, nor here Callum have responded to my detailed Bayesian argument otherwise. So I would still wait for Callum to reply to that. Callum said briefly that he could account for the laws of nature on the resurrection hypothesis, but again, Callum did not do what I did. I gave 3 mutually exclusive, jointly exhaustive hypotheses. Again, I accepted his conclusion that the posterior probability of the resurrection on the facts of F is 1 minus 10 to the 14th. I accepted that. And again, he did not respond to the fact that my argument takes this into account and shows that the ultimate probability of the resurrection on all the evidence being E, turns out to be remarkably low.
Greg Caven's closing point cuts to the heart of the problem for the Christian claim. You can't just assume what God would want to do without proving it first. God raised Jesus is not an inevitable conclusion from theism. It's an assumption built on a specific theological value system that itself needs evidence. Without that, you're not working with objective probability, just personal belief. The gospel accounts themselves are another major issue. When you line up Matthew, Luke, and John, you see deliberate literary editing to serve theological goals, not consistent historical reporting. Matthew pushes Galilee appearances, Luke erases them to keep events in Jerusalem, and John tries to harmonize both traditions because he's writing even later. This is exactly how legendary development works. Later writers reshape earlier stories to fit new purposes. We also know from ancient biography studies that the Gospels follow the patterns of Greco-Roman literary construction, not modern investigative history. Scholars like Bart Ehrman and Michael Goulder have shown how changing small details, like who first saw Jesus, where he appeared, or what was said, was common in ancient storytelling to make a theological point. That's why the contradictions in the resurrection narratives are not trivial. They are signs we're looking at crafted literature, not reliable eyewitness reports. Even if you grant, for the sake of argument, a high probability for appearances, that doesn't prove a physical resurrection. Visions and apparitions are well-documented psychological phenomena, especially in grief. From Marian apparitions to loved ones seen after death. The disciples' experiences fit that pattern far better than a violation of all known biological laws. So, when all the evidence is considered, historical context, textual editing, human psychology, the probability of a literal resurrection remains remarkably low. Passionate belief can spread a story, but belief is not the same as truth. If the resurrection stories were shaped by theological agendas and later editing, can we really treat them as reliable historical evidence? Share your thoughts in the comments, hit like if you found this breakdown useful, and subscribe so you don't miss our next deep dive into the history and evidence behind religious claims.